Nos Hosseini, Iranian-Australian and activist, welcome to Behind the Headlines. It's really a privilege and a treat to be able to speak with you on this episode. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come onto the podcast, Adam. I really do appreciate it. And it was such a pleasure and a privilege to meet with you right after state conference and have the conversation about what transpired on the day, which I'm sure we'll talk about today.
We're going to. I'm still a bit sort of taken aback by it, but before we get into the deep politics, let's start with a bit of your background, Nos. Your parents fled Iran, I think, when you were a child. And before we get into the politics, what do you remember about, growing up and hearing about the country they left behind? What shaped your understanding of Iran?
Well, not to paint a complete grim picture of my childhood and to sort of portray it in such a light, but my earliest childhood memories once we came to Australia and settled in here were watching my parents prepare folders and binders of information that they would show to the Australian public just so that they can raise awareness around the human rights violations that are being perpetrated in Iran. It's within those binders and folders were horrific pictures of people who have had their eyes gouged and photos of political prisoners hanging from cranes. So it was quite confronting as a child to be exposed to that type of imagery. But I guess it's something that I got used to seeing, which is hard to sort of phrase it like that, but it is something that I've gotten used to seeing, and I have shielded my children from that. And not to say that my parents wanted me to be exposed to that, but it just happened that they were so invested in fighting for the human rights and freedom of Iranians from the moment we arrived in Australia in 1989. It's just something that became a part of our life and a prominent feature of our life. And I'd see my father preparing, videos to show at our community forums and meetings, and he'd be sitting there and putting together footage of prisoners that had survived the most horrific forms of torture. So I remember seeing footage of this woman who had an electric shock baton placed on the bottom of her feet. So the cruelty that we hear about now in the media is nothing new to Iranians. It's something that's unfortunately characterized the last 47 or so years since the Islamic regime came to power and captured all Iranians hostage.
Many Australians see headlines about, Iran, nuclear, its nuclear program or missile attacks or the Strait of Hormuz, but they rarely hear about ordinary Iranians, right? They very rarely hear. If you would describe life for the average Iranian woman in one conversation, and I'm going to ask it in two ways. Before 1979 and since the regime, what would Australians, two things, understand, and what would they struggle to understand?
Well, I was born after the revolution, and my parents have had many conversations with me about what life was like prior to the revolution. And not to simplify it, but sometimes it is easier to sort of simplify it as much as possible. But women had the right to women had more control over their bodies, and they had the right to choose how they wish to dress. My dad said that women would be walking down the streets in their bikinis. They would go to the beach. They'd be wearing the bikinis. It was quite Western. People would play music. A lot of prominent Iranian singers would hold concerts and sing in public and dance. And there was a lot of association between men and women. It was the way that you would imagine be like in a Western country. So it was quite relaxed. People were able to express themselves in terms of the arts, how they wish to dress. In terms of the political landscape, my parents mentioned that there were certain, restrictions there, and there were definitely more freedoms. It wasn't as repressive as modern day Iran is now. But it seemed we were able to study, whereas now, following the 1979 revolution, women need to get the permission of a male guardian to be in order to be able to work and go to university and to choose what they wish to study at university. There's legalized gender apartheid. So by that I mean women under the eyes of the law, their testimony is worth half of that of a male. Their right to inheritance is different to their male counterparts, and they're quite restricted in terms of what they can do. So a woman can't be a judge in Iran because the regime characterizes women as being very emotional and incapable of a rational thought, whereas prior to the 1979 revolution, women were able to hold such positions of power. So the status of women since following the 1979 revolution has deteriorated rapidly, and a woman in the eyes of the law has less rights than that of a male counterpart. If they wish to travel abroad or apply for a passport, or if a child wishes to apply for a passport, they need to seek the permission of their father or a male guardian or their husband. And women's inheritance is affected as well under those laws. A woman's testimony is worth half of that of a man's. And
This is medieval. I mean, this is medieval theology, right? Like, this is what happened in medieval times in Christianity and in biblical times. It just staggers to hear that in the 21st century we're dealing with, I think you put it well, legalized gender apartheid. I want to come back to the issue of why this is a struggle in left-wing politics for its, just to accept it at face value. I do want to come back to that because I think that's just so important. But if we can go further, just Nos, around you, because you've chosen to become one of Australia's most outspoken advocates for the Iranian people. And we know the regime follows you and the regime targets. Activism comes with a cost. What made you decide that being silent was no longer an option and that you would pay the price of the regime targeting you for your speaking up?
I think it's the responsibility of any Iranian who's able to live under the benefits of a Western democratic nation like Australia. And, considering we live in a relatively safe country, I think it's imperative that we as Iranians or members of the Iranian diaspora community take a step and talk about what Iranians are, the medieval and theocratic conditions that dictate the lives of Iranians that haven't been as fortunate enough as us to flee from the repressive regime. When I and my family were very lucky to get out when we did, and we've been very lucky to be afforded the protection of the Hawke Labor government, who enabled us to come here and start a new chapter. But in starting that new chapter and in starting a new life, it didn't mean that we had to close off that chapter and forget about the people that we've left behind in Iran. So it's always been really important to me, and knowing what I know about what my parents went through in Iran. My father was the leader of the union movement when he was 18 or 19 years of age. He worked at the National Oil Company and he fought for workers' rights. And I was quite inspired by their story and their journey. I feel that it's my duty as an Iranian to continue to talk about Iranians and to amplify their voice and amplify their struggles. I don't want to say that I want to be their voice, because they do have a voice. Their voice has been stifled. And as we've seen over the course of the last 47 years, whenever they've had an opportunity to do so, they've bravely and courageously used that voice to send a message to the world, which is, we need this regime gone, and we need to see the end of this regime and reclaim our rights and have dignity and freedom.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Your father was a union leader. Nos, you're a member of the Labor Party and an activist in the Labor Party, and we met at the Victorian ALP State Conference. And there you argued very passionately, I think quite rightly, that the party was unwilling in motions it had put up about Iran to explicitly condemn the Iranian regime and its systematic human rights abuses, right? What did that debate reveal to you about the way progressive politics views Iran now?
I thought it was, I thought it really did expose the hypocrisy and the desire to back Iran in a sense, just because the regime is seen to be resisting against Western imperialism. And I think that undermines the movement for regime change that we've seen transpire in Iran over the course of the last 47 years. Iranian people have been brutally murdered. They've been sentenced to executions. Their executions have been carried out. They've been tortured in the most horrific ways in medieval prisons like Evin prison, which is affectionately referred to as the University of Evin, because it's home to intellects and political prisoners and activists and unionists and people fighting for environmental causes, as well as lawyers and journalists. And where you
So here you are. Well, okay, you were, and here you are, as a social activist, a labor activist, a union official, and all of a sudden the Labor Party refuses to condemn the Iranian regime because its anti-Americanism is greater than just the fundamentals of social and human justice. It was a shock at conference to see your amendment around condemning the regime itself over its abuses be knocked down, for those that aren't aware. And it was only sort of the anti-American part of it that got up. Tell me about the conversations you've had with members in Labor since. How have they felt since that time about what they did to the Iranian people?
Well, I had conversations with delegates right after that motion was passed and my proposed amendment was knocked back. And members of the left were quite surprised. They said that they expressed to me that they agreed with my amendment, and they were very confused as to why the left did not support my amendment. They thought that it was quite obvious, and it came as a shock to me, and it came as a shock to members of the Iranian community quite broadly. And I've explained to them that delegates put forward motions and they're not necessarily binding, and they don't necessarily affect Labor policy broadly.
Yes.
And it was quite heartwarming to see the Premier take a stand and say that she did not agree with the position that was taken.
Yeah.
And that, and she also used that opportunity to call out the regime for orchestrating attacks on Australian soil. So I think where it matters, it was clear that the leaders, the party elders or the leaders, the elected representatives were with the Iranian people, but quite disheartening that members of the left of the Labor Party weren't willing to support an amendment that was so uncontroversial and not be willing to condemn the regime for its role in those human rights violations.
Yeah.
And if you're, you need to take a balanced approach. If you're calling out the US for invading Iran and for engaging in this level of conflict and warfare, you can't ignore the reality of life for Iranians under this theocratic dictatorship over the last 47 years, because the conflict that we're condemning through that motion is one which is between the US and Iran. But what about the conflict that's between the Iranian regime and the Iranian people that have been held hostage and are living under horrific conditions every day?
Just for the purposes for the audience, your amendment at that when it was debating the conflict between America and Iran was stating that Iran was the oppressor of its own people. It wasn't taking a political position about the war, but just stating that it needed to be clear that Iran, is the oppressor. And for you, naming the oppressor was, clearly the important point here. But, progressive politics has the anti-US obsession overrode any concern with the Iranian people at a, human level. It was the most extraordinary thing to see. And I'm with you that, the leaders of the party just, dismissed it as ridiculous, silly, I think was the word. So as someone who's lived with the consequences of the Islamic Republic, Nos, what do you say now to Western activists who describe Iran primarily through the lens of anti-imperialism or resistance to the West?
I think that's taking a very simplified approach. I mean, we're in a way empowering the regime to continue its reign of terror across the world. I mean, as you know, the regime has for many, many years funded its proxies across the Middle East. It funds Hamas, it funds Hezbollah at the expense of ordinary Iranians. It diverts funds that really should be invested into improving the lives of its own citizens. So you raise a really good point there. I think we shouldn't be backing the regime just because of its perceived status or perceived position as anti-imperialist. What we've seen over the course of the last couple of weeks is that the regime is willing to do what it takes to cling on to power and remain in power, so much so that it's come to the table and has entered into negotiations with President Trump and the West, which it apparently opposes and despises.
Yeah.
So we can't be putting the regime on a pedestal just because of its perceived position as anti-Western and imperialistic, because when push comes to shove, the regime is willing to negotiate with the West and vice versa, just to maintain its stranglehold over the Iranian people. And to what end do we need to to what end? We're confronted by a regime who has been unapologetically been funding campaigns of terror abroad.
Yeah.
It has been responsible for over 450 assassinations of Iranian people. And from the beginning of over the last 47 years, it has been responsible for attacks on foreign countries. I mean, the Israeli Community Center in Buenos Aires was targeted.
Yeah, not the Israeli Community Center, the Jewish Community Center.
The Jewish Community.
The Jewish Community Center, was bombed in the 90s.
Yeah, and no one's been held account. No one
has ever been held to account. Here in Australia, the ASIO revealed that, Iran directed the attacks on Jewish targets in Australia, as we know. And as a consequence, the Prime Minister expelled the Iranian ambassador, an extraordinary thing. So as an Iranian Australia, how do you react to that? How do you react to the Iranian desire to target, Jewish Australians directly through terror here, Argentina, and now we know in England as well?
Well, Yeah, and I mean, it's also directed an Australian national who is in Iraq to direct attacks on the Australian community. So it's quite concerning, and it shows the the reach that the regime has. And where it can, it tries to keep its hands clean. It uses proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. It uses bikie gangs and other criminal enterprises to conduct these acts of terror against Iranians and Australians more broadly as well. I'm glad that the Australian Prime Minister finally expelled the Iranian ambassador, but the Iranian embassy is still operating.
Yes.
So, although the ambassador, who is simply a figurehead, has been expelled, it doesn't put a stop to consular staff gathering intelligence and activating its sleeper cells and networks that it has planted here in Australia from gathering intelligence about members of the Iranian diaspora community and then in turn punishing their family members in Iran. And I, as well as members of the community, have had first-hand experience of members of our family being targeted. Members of my family have been interrogated, arrested, imprisoned, and they've disappeared as well just because of our activism here in Australia.
You've had members of your family imprisoned because you've found your own voice in your own way in Australia about the Iranian regime, and they've imprisoned them in Iran.
That's right. That's right. And when they've managed to, when they've been released, members of our family have directly and indirectly communicated with us and expressed that they were arrested because of us. My dad's cousin was imprisoned along with his two sons a couple of years ago during the Woman Life Freedom Movement. And when his son was released, his son contacted my dad and said, "Please don't contact my father ever again, because if anything were to happen to him, I hold you responsible, because it's your activism in Australia that's put my father's life at risk." So my dad had to cut all communication with his cousin. And an uncle of mine was interrogated a couple of years ago, and they made him call my father and put the phone on speaker and communicate with my father and say to him that, you know, you need to stop your political activities, and I'm here in their custody because of your activities in Australia. So they do what they can to silence those that dare to speak up against them in Iran by executing them, by shooting young women in the eyes with rubber bullets, by sentencing people to execution, by trying to stifle their voices at every chance and every opportunity. And we see that same behaviour being carried out here in Australia, in the sense that they're trying to limit our voices and target us by targeting our family just to silence us. And many people in the community haven't backed down. I mean, myself, my family, other people that I know are just as motivated as ever to continue advocating for change in Iran, because
the extraordinary courage that your family and members of the Women Life Freedom Movement exhibit in the face, knowing this regime will take action against you. And, you know, the regime continues, and the West underestimates. I mean, I feel the West underestimates the machinery of repression. I want to talk about this fantastic speech in Parliament this week by Senator Raf Ciccone, where he took to task the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, for an interview that I'm going to say it apologised for the Iranian regime. It was disgusting. it equated some people demonstrating for the regime, which oppressive regimes organise, as though that was equal to all of the people in the regime, you know, the tens of millions that stand against the regime and the things you talked about. He said that it was absurd that the ABC would even characterise Iran as a regime that has widespread support amongst the Iranian population. You know, he said access is controlled, movement is controlled, information is controlled. And when governments determine where journalists can go and who they speak to, they shape not simply what is reported, but what can be reported. Why do you think so many Western audiences just underestimate how sophisticated the Iranian regime is at manipulating international perceptions, Nos?
Look, I think it's just easier for them. I think it's just easier for them to overlook what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, you mentioned that the reporting showed that the regime had support and they showed footage of the
Widespread.
protests.
The whole point of it was the ABC, widespread support. Extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
It really is.
It can't be just because it's easy. What's this perception?
Iran-International did some reporting not long ago and reported that political prisoners and prisoners were forced to participate in these pro-regime protests, and you could tell that they were in custody because they had ankle bracelets on their ankles. And they also, you know, it doesn't surprise me when I hear stories of families of detained protesters being forced to participate in these pro-regime protests, and members of the Iranian community who have had family members killed by the regime who have been forced into silence just to get the bodies of their loved ones back so that they can at least give them a proper burial and say a proper goodbye, are being forced to participate in these pro-regime protests. So we as Iranians know the reality. We know what's happening on the ground. And I think this is a very dangerous style of reporting by the journalist in question. Because if a repressive regime is restricting you as a journalist, just imagine how difficult it is for journalists in Iran to report the truth. And it's not as though reporting was balanced. They were told that you can't speak to anybody other than who we arrange for you, and you can't go anywhere unless we approve it. So in what universe did they think that they were going to be able to provide an accurate representation of what life is like in Iran? And if you want to talk about, I think one of the headlines was the lionesses of the revolution, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
The lionesses of the revolution were the women that were at the front lines of the Woman Life Freedom Movement, who were standing in front of tanks in the Kurdistan regions of Iran and resisting. The women who are being raped in custody and released, even though they were forced to sign undertakings and were told not to participate in anti-regime demonstrations. And those that were wounded and injured were going back to the site of the protests the following day and were not deterred. They're the real lionesses of the revolution.
I thought that headline just showed, I'm going to be really blunt in my feeling about this, how debased the ABC can be in its desire to be so like some of your comrades. You know, the desire to be so anti-US means that the lionesses of the revolution, as they painted it, were the supporters of the regime. I mean, that is so debased, Nos.
Exactly.
It is, in light of everything you've told us, in light of all that we know about the Women Life Freedom Movement, in light of any of the facts, for the ABC to do that was a new low in, not in reporting, because it's not, it's activism. And I was struck, but it was just, I don't know what they were trying to show, you know. It wasn't, I'm just not sure. But listening to Raf in the Senate, and I listened to his speech, I was struck by one sentence in particular. And he said, and I'm going to quote, "What Australians were shown, but also what was hidden from view." For those of us fortunate enough to live in a liberal democracy, it's almost impossible to imagine what's hidden from view.
Mm-hmm.
So if I asked you this one question, if Australians were allowed to see just one thing that the Iranian regime desperately doesn't want them to see, that the ABC would refuse to show, I'm throwing that in, but what's that one thing that you think it should be that would show the true nature and character of this regime in Iran right now?
I think if you speak to any displaced person who has fled from that oppressive regime and hear their stories, you'll find out, you'll see that, you know, once you have conversations with refugees, for instance, who have come to Australia over the course of the last couple of years or, you know, last couple of decades, their stories are quite similar and they are quite reflective of what's happening on the ground in Iran. Look, I think storytelling is really powerful. I mean, I think we need to hear from people that are directly impacted or were directly impacted by repressive regimes. I mean, I come from a family of political activists and unionists, and members of my family were executed by the regime because of their opposition to the regime. My second cousin was executed by the regime when he was in his 20s, and another was executed when he was 14 years of age. And it just it's horrifying. My dad's shared a lot of stories with me about what life was like in Iran for him and for members of his family, and his cousins and members of our extended family were executed by the Iranian regime. My dad told me about the harrowing story and experience of his aunt, whose son was executed by firing squad because of his opposition to the regime. And his body was discarded in a mass pit, and his mother tried to look for him for days, and she didn't know what had happened to him. And what happens in those situations is mothers, fathers frantically go to hospitals, they go to morgues, and they try and find out what they can. And she was frantically searching for her son, and she was told, he's been killed, and you need to come and look through the piles of bodies and find him. And
I can't imagine.
she had a difficult job. Yeah.
I can't imagine.
Difficult task as a mother of having to sort through piles of bodies and look through piles of bodies to try and find her son's dead, lifeless body. And she took his body away and buried him. And to this day, because he was executed for political reasons, he's been buried in an unmarked grave. They can't even honor him in death. There is no tombstone. There's just cement all over it, all over where he was buried. Yeah. And we see that it still happens today. I mean, during the Women Life Freedom Movement, many political activists, ordinary Iranians who resisted against the regime and stood up in solidarity with Mahsa Amini and many others like Mahsa Amini, people who came before her, people who came after her that were executed by this regime. And their families had to pay for the cost of the bullet that killed them, or they had to pay for the cost of the crane that was responsible for
the hanging. As you describe this, I think of the ABC's reporting, and I think of ALP voting, to cover all of this. And that's what it is. It's to cover it all up, to claim that because America is somehow involved, that is a worse evil than your family having to go through, I'm sorry to hear it, a pile of bodies in which to identify their son so they could claim him and then been given a bill to pay for the bullet. Just the, not ignorance, the inhumanity of that. I know you've said in interviews that the Iranian people do need help from the outside to get this regime out, finished.
Yeah.
That it, in a way, that challenges, of course, the conventional wisdom and the anti-Western idea that, regime change should only come from within when the people are ready. Why do you believe outside pressure is essential?
Look, I do believe that change should come from within, but I think what the last 47 years have shown, the people always fall short. And they haven't been successful in overthrowing the regime because the regime is an institution. It feels as though it's impenetrable. It feels as though it has such a stranglehold and a strong grip over the Iranian society and the nation as a whole that dismantling it is very difficult. And to dismantle a repressive regime, you need to put a stop to its campaign of terror abroad, and you need to do what you can to restrict its economic lifeline. And what we've seen over the last 47 years is that the Western world switches between a policy of appeasement and alternates between a policy of appeasement and negotiation.
Yeah.
And you can't negotiate with a repressive regime, and nor should you, because the victims in all of this are ultimately the Iranian people. I think the Iranian people are strong, brave, courageous, but they're defenseless and unarmed.
Yeah.
Over the last 47 years, they've risked their lives. They've been shot at. They've been raped. They've been maimed. Their voices have been stifled. Members of minority communities such as the Baha'is, the Kurds, the Baluchis have been restricted. They have been imprisoned because of their beliefs.
Yeah.
And when you have a situation where people are trying so hard to resist but don't have the means, they don't have the financial means, and they don't have weapons at their disposal, well, how are they meant to overthrow a regime with their bare hands? And I think that's why it's really important for Western governments to help in any way that they can and support the Iranian people. And in supporting Iranian people, you need to not support their oppressor, and their oppressor being the Iranian regime.
So one of the mechanisms in doing that has been now sanctions, right? Which is what the Americans have done with some, they've ratcheted up that pressure, as you said. We talk about sanctions. Whenever we do, I think it's the punters who suffer. The Revolutionary Guards controls the economy of Iran. More than 50% of all businesses come from the Revolutionary Guards. Iran is some theocratic military dictatorship of some description now. And when sanctions are applied to restrict the activities of the regime and its economic lifelines, it's 80 million Iranians who suffer. What are your thoughts on that? Is this a pain that is needed to go through in order to weaken the regime so that it can be overthrown? Or are there alternative external ways the West can help the people of Iran overthrow the regime?
Look, I do agree that ultimately it is the Iranian people who suffer when sanctions are imposed and life does become more difficult for them. But how much more difficult is it going to be than the last 47 years of life under this brutal dictatorship that they've had to endure? And I've had conversations with Iranians in the diaspora community, and I've had conversations with people inside Iran. And I would say, based on my conversations and their conversations, there is support for sanctions because the intent is to cripple the regime. And
Yes.
in crippling the economy, you do also cripple the regime because whatever funds are generated by exports, for instance, they're not reinvested into the community.
People don't get it anyway. I mean,
Exactly.
the mafia that run the state, take it all for themselves. It's well known that the Ayatollahs have billions stuffed away anyway. I mean, that's on the record. It's not a conspiracy. It's just fact that they're wealthy. They've stashed it all.
Exactly, and they're due to inherit even more wealth because under this proposed MOU that's on the table, if 300 billion US dollars is given or gifted to the Iranian regime,
they'll take it.
Yeah, for so-called, rebuilding efforts. Well, that's very naive. It's very naive to think that those funds are going to be reinvested into the Iranian, the Iranian community and going to be reinvested into the nation to rebuild the country or the economy. Or
we know it won't. I mean, we know it won't.
It won't.
We know it won't. It'll be used to prop up the regime and rebuild, its missile and nuclear capabilities. They've even said it. So
exactly, and they're going to continue to fund their proxies. They'll continue to fund their intelligence gathering campaigns in countries like Australia, and they'll continue to use those funds to
oppress ordinary Iranians.
Oppress Iranians.
So, Nos, I spoke to an Iranian earlier this year, and when Trump texted at the beginning of the war, help is on its way. Like you, he's just an Iranian-Australian who wants the regime gone, his family suffer. He just wants to see an Iran emerge that is a normal country. And he was excited. When Trump said help's on its way, they thought maybe this is the external help. He's no fan of America, but this was going to be the help that would get regime change happening. Between then, the war, and this memorandum of understanding, are you let down by what Trump said he would do and what he's doing now? Are Iranians let down by this? Did they really believe it was going to change? And are you just flattened by what's happened now?
Look, I would say that we have, as a community, we have mixed feelings about, these sentiments and these comments that were made. I would say that there was a sense of hope that was instilled in people's hearts, and people inside Iran held on to a lot of hope as well. And when President Trump said help is on its way, reclaim your country, it's up to you now, people took to the streets and they were slaughtered en masse. We still don't know how many thousands of people were executed, but reports indicate that between 40,000 to 90,000 Iranians were executed. And whether it be 2,000 or more, the fact of the matter is Iranians were slaughtered by
tens of thousands in 2 days. In 2 days.
And that came after President Trump inspired hope in people. And not to say that we thought that America's going to come and save the country and save the day, but people thought that the time was ripe for picking and that something was actually going to happen after many, many years of resistance. And then to see what's transpired over the course of the last couple of weeks and the conversations that have been held and the MOU that's been proposed, the cynic in me just thinks, well, was all of that just deployed to get the regime to the negotiating table?
Yeah.
Because at the expense of the Iranian people and at the expense of human rights, this MOU has been reached without any consideration for the human rights violations that have occurred and been no consideration given to political prisoners and people that have been sentenced to death by execution.
What is it that the West fundamentally misses? You know, Iran is just one, probably like with North Korea, you know, it would be the worst regimes on the planet. Iran, you know, this anti-imperialism that we support Iran because it's anti-imperialist. I mean, they're providing, you know, drones to Russia, you know, the most imperialist country on the planet right now, invading Ukraine, bombing it with Iranian drones, you know, lifeline with China, you know, again, China, Iran, North Korea, Russia. What is it, Nos, do you think that the West misses in its desire to negotiate with regimes that play them for fools? What do we miss?
Well, I don't know what they fear. We need to stand up to the bully that is the Iranian regime, and we're not doing that. And what do we fear? I mean, we need to support the Iranian people in their efforts to overthrow this regime. And we spoke about sanctions earlier, and I think that sanctions are an effective mechanism. We need to also look at closing down embassies. You know, we need to close down the embassies across Western countries at the very least and go beyond simply expelling ambassadors. We need to look at enacting Magnitsky-style sanctions against the perpetrators of human rights violations against Iranian people and hold the regime to account for its 47-year torture-stained and blood-stained human rights record. We've seen the Australian government take a lead role on this in terms of enacting the Magnitsky-style sanctions, but the regime is still able to circumvent those sanctions by getting third parties who hold powers of attorney for regime officials to come to places like Australia and buy up property and invest in Australia. So those sanctions need to go so far as extending to benefactors as well as members of the immediate family of these perpetrators of human rights abuse.
Yeah.
And we need to stop this policy of appeasement that's characterized the relationship between the West and the Iranian regime. And we need to stop extending the regime's lifeline as we'll see happen once this MOU goes through in its current form.
Yeah.
And it just shows that the conflict was all for nothing, and the Iranians who were killed at the hands of their own government died in vain if the perpetrators of these human rights abuses are
if they get away and the regime perpetuates.
Exactly.
It's so complicated because, you know, continuous bombing doesn't do it. Sanctions alone's not doing it. This is a regime whose definition of winning is purely survival. And that is something I know that the West hasn't got its head around, right? Endurance is its definition of success, and an inability to help Iranians on the ground to take control of their own destiny is the missing piece here. Easily said, hard to be able to do, but that's got to be the solution here. It's got to be to help your family in Iran and others to take control of this. So Nos, imagine, I want to finish with this. Imagine a young woman in Tehran is somehow able to see this interview. She's frightened. She's wondering whether anyone outside of Iran is aware of her struggle. What do you want to say to her? What hope do you want to be able to give to her?
Well, I would, if I'm so lucky, I would love to express to her and to her friends and networks that their struggle for freedom, their struggle for equality, their struggle for human rights is one that we share as well. And they're not forgotten. We haven't forgotten all the victims of this brutal regime that have paid the ultimate price with their lives. And we continue to remember and reflect on those that we've lost along the way, such as Masajina Amini, who was killed by at the hands of the morality police just because of the way that she wore her headscarf. Nor will we forget the likes of Vahid Bani Omarion, who was executed by the regime because of his membership of a leftist group. Nor will we forget the countless thousands, tens of thousands of Iranians that have died.
Given their lives for the freedom of 80 million Iranian people.
I want her and others to know that they did not die in vain, because their memory lives on through Iranians inside Iran and Iranians in the diaspora who will, to their fighting breath, continue to talk about Iran so that all hope is not lost and that they don't feel that they have been forgotten, because the new cycle moves on, but the Iranian diaspora community will not move on.
Tell your family there are many of us who stand with you unconditionally, unapologetically, who know that the thousands of Iranians who've died, that their memories will not be lost, but that they will be a continual inspiration. We stand with you, Nos Hosseini. We stand with your family. We stand clearly with those who've been so ill-treated. And as ALP National Conference comes up, we will be with you in the battle to claim the truth about what this Iranian regime is and what it means for Iranian Australians to stand on the side of freedom and justice in this cause. We wish you well. We wish you continued strength. May your family see better days, and we hope that everybody of yours in your extended family and friendship circles in Iran are safe and will see better days ahead. Thank you so much for coming on Behind the Headlines. You are an inspiration, and long may you fly the flag and the good voice for women and all Iranians in Australia.
Thank you so much, Adam. I really do appreciate the opportunity to appear on this podcast and appreciate your unconditional support and solidarity with the people of Iran and with this struggle that we're all fighting together to finally see the end of this despotic regime. And may the perpetrators of these injustices finally be held to account. We know that the late Supreme Leader Khamenei will never be held to account for his role in the human rights violations, but we hope that all those that come after him and all those that are responsible for ending the lives of the brave, courageous souls that are struggling for freedom and human rights will be held accountable and finally be brought to justice.
And may the Iranian people be free, inshallah.
Thank you so much.